The year is 799 CE. Deep in the rainforests of what we now call southern Mexico, a man in elaborate shade and feather regalia climbs the steep stone steps of Temple 14 for what he doesn't yet know will be the final time. His name is Kinech Bakal III, and he is the high priest of Palenque, one of the most powerful city-states in the Mayan world. For over 1,000 years, his ancestors have performed the sacred rituals that maintain the cosmic balance, ensure the rains come, and keep the gods appeased. But something is terribly wrong. The rains that should have come with the wet season are sporadic and weak. The maize crops that feed nearly 100,000 people across Palenque's territories are withering in the fields. Trade routes that once brought wealth from across Mesoamerica have fallen silent as neighboring city-states collapse, one by one into warfare and chaos. And now, refugees stream into Palenque's outskirts. Speaking of abandoned temples, empty palaces, and cities being swallowed by the jungle, Kinech Bakal III doesn't know it yet, but he is witnessing the end of classical Mayan civilization now. Collapse so complete that within 50 years, most of the great cities will be empty, their knowledge scattered to the wind, their writing system forgotten, their astronomical calculations lost to time. He is about to become the last guardian of secrets that took millennia to accumulate, watching helplessly as one of humanity's most sophisticated civilizations dissolves around him. This is the story of that final stand, told through the eyes of one man who held the spiritual center of his world together until the very last moment. It's a story about the fragility of even the most advanced societies, about how environmental crises can cascade into civilizational collapse, and about the terrible burden of being the last keeper of ancient wisdom in a world that's forgetting how to remember. But to understand how it all ended, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when the Maya first learned to read the stars, tame the jungle, and build monuments that would outlast empires. The story begins not with collapse, but with one of humanity's greatest achievements in urban planning, mathematics, astronomy, and art. The Maya didn't emerge from nowhere. They built their civilization layer by layer, century by century, across the tropical lowlands of Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, and western Honduras, creating a network of city-states that would dominate Mesoamerica for over a millennium. Palenque itself was founded around 100 BCE, but it didn't become a major power until the 6th century CE, during what archaeologists call the late classic period. This was the golden age of Mayan civilization, when population densities in some areas exceeded those of medieval Europe, when Mayan astronomers calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern measurements, and when their artists created sculptures and murals that still take your breath away today. The city that Kinech Bakal III inherited was a masterpiece of engineering and aesthetics, built into terraced hillsides overlooking the Usumancia River Valley. Palenque's temples and palaces seem to grow organically from the limestone bedrock. The Temple of Inscriptions, built to house the tomb of his most famous predecessor, Kinech Bakal I the Great, contained the longest hieroglyphic text known from the ancient Americas, over 600 individual glyphs recording the deeds of kings and the movements of gods across cosmic time. But Palenque was more than just architecture. It was the center of a complex web of political, economic, and religious relationships that stretched across hundreds of miles. Tribute flowed in from dozens of smaller settlements. Obsidian from the volcanic highlands of Guatemala was shaped into razors and spear points. Jade from the Motagua River Valley was carved into sacred objects and royal ornaments. Cacao beans from the Pacific coast were processed into the chocolate drink that only nobles could afford. Quetzal feathers from the cloud forests were woven into ceremonial costumes that transformed kings into living gods. The high priests of Palenque weren't just religious figures, they were the intellectual elite of their society. They maintained the complex calendar systems that regulated agricultural cycles and religious festivals. They calculated eclipses decades in advance and tracked the movements of Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. They preserved the historical records that legitimized royal dynasties and recorded the genealogies that connected earthly rulers to divine ancestors. Most importantly, they were the keepers of the ritual knowledge that maintained what the Maya called the burden of time, the cosmic responsibility to perform the ceremonies that kept the universe functioning properly. Every 20 days, every month, every year brought its own requirements. bloodletting ceremonies to nourish the gods,
ball-game rituals that reenacted the cosmic struggle between order and chaos,
dedication ceremonies for new buildings that anchored
them to sacred geography,
calendar ceremonies that marked the completion of significant time periods and renewed the cosmic order for another cycle. By the time our story begins in the late 8th century, this system had been functioning continuously for over 600 years.
Palenque III was born into a world where the rituals had always worked, where the rains had always come more or less, where the cosmic order seemed as permanent as the stone temples where he performed his duties. He had trained since childhood for his role, learning not just the ceremonial procedures, but the complex mathematics and astronomy that underpinned them. He could calculate when Venus would rise as the morning star, predict eclipses, and determine the most auspicious days for everything from royal marriages to building dedications.
He knew the 6-day sacred calendar by heart, could recite the
mythological cycles that explained how the world was created and destroyed multiple times before the current era began. He understood that his role wasn't just ceremonial, it was essential to the functioning of society itself. The Maya believed that time was cyclical, that the same patterns repeated at different scales, and that human actions could influence cosmic events.
A poorly performed ritual could bring drought.
A miscalculated ceremony could invite disaster.
The high priest's knowledge wasn't just academic, it was quite literally a matter of life and death for everyone in Palenque's sphere of influence, and for centuries it had worked. Palenque had grown from a small settlement to a regional power, had survived wars with rivals like Calacu and Tonina, had weathered political crises and dynastic changes. The system seemed robust, tested by time, validated by success. But systems that seem robust often carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and by 799 CE, those seeds were beginning to germinate in ways that no amount of ritual knowledge could prevent. The first signs were subtle, the kind of anomalies that might escape notice in a single season but become impossible to ignore when they persist year after year.
The meteorological records that Palenque III maintained as part of his ritual duties notes about rainfall patterns, flooding cycles, and seasonal variations that were essential for timing agricultural ceremonies began showing disturbing trends. The rains, when they came, were increasingly erratic.
Some years brought devastating floods that washed away entire terraced fields and damaged the intricate canal systems that channeled water to Palenque's urban gardens.
Other years brought barely enough precipitation to keep the cenotes and reservoirs from running dry.
The predictable alternation between wet and dry seasons that had regulated life in the Maya lowlands for millennia was breaking down into chaos. Modern paleoclimatologists studying lake sediments and cave formations across the Yucatan Peninsula have identified what they call the terminal classic drought, a period of severe water stress that began around 760 CE and intensified throughout the late 8th and 9th centuries. But Palenque III didn't have access to scientific instruments or regional data.
All he knew was that the rituals that had successfully petitioned the rain god Chark for generations were producing increasingly unpredictable results. At first, he responded by intensifying the ceremonies.
More bloodletting offerings, more elaborate festivals,
extended periods of fasting and purification.
He consulted the ancient codices, looking for precedents, for variations in ritual procedure that might be more effective under changing conditions.
He performed divination ceremonies, casting maize kernels and interpreting their patterns according to techniques passed down through dozens of generations of high priests. But the drought persisted, and with it came cascading effects that no
amount of ritual innovation could address. The agricultural crisis struck first and hardest.
Mayan civilization was built on intensive maize cultivation that supported population densities far higher than the tropical environment could sustain through hunting and gathering alone. Complex systems of raised fields, terraced hillsides,
and forest gardens had been developed over centuries, each technique adapted to specific microclimates and soil conditions. But all of them depended on predictable rainfall patterns as crop yields declined. The tribute system that funded Palenque's elaborate court culture began to break down. Outlying settlements that had once provided maize, cacao, textiles, and
labor to the capital found themselves struggling to feed their own populations. Some stopped sending tribute entirely. Others sent delegations pleading for assistance, grain stores, emergency supplies, anything that might help them survive until the next harvest. Palenque III found himself in an impossible position.
The royal granaries that had once served as insurance against temporary shortages were rapidly being depleted.
The king and his advisors looked to him for explanations, for ritual solutions, for some way to restore the natural order that had sustained their civilization for so long. According to Mayan worldview, droughts weren't random natural events, they were symptoms of cosmic imbalance, indicators that the relationship between humans and gods had somehow been disrupted.
The high priest's job was to diagnose the spiritual cause and prescribe the appropriate ritual remedy.
But what if the problem was too large, too systemic, too unprecedented for traditional solutions to work?
The crisis deepened when the first reports arrived of troubles beyond Palenque's borders. Messengers brought news that Copan, one of the
most important Maya cities in the southern highlands, had stopped erecting dated monuments, a sign that its royal dynasty had ended or lost power. The great city of Tikal, Palenque's sometime ally and frequent rival, was reportedly struggling with internal conflicts as noble families competed for control over dwindling resources. Even more disturbing were reports from the northern Yucatan, where several cities had been completely abandoned, their populations scattered to the winds.
These weren't just political collapses, they were demographic catastrophes, the kind of complete societal breakdown that the Maya had no historical precedent for understanding. Palenque III realized that he wasn't just dealing with a local crisis anymore. Something was happening across the entire Maya world. Something that transcended the boundaries between city-states and challenged the fundamental assumptions on which Mayan civilization was built. The spark that would ultimately consume classical Maya civilization wasn't a single event. It was a slow-burning fuse of environmental stress, agricultural failure, and social disruption that created conditions for a perfect storm of civilizational collapse.
And Palenque III, trained to maintain cosmic order through ritual precision, found himself standing at the epicenter of chaos that no ceremony could control, but he didn't know that yet. In 799 CE, he still believed that the right combination of offerings, fasting, and divine petition could restore the balance that had been lost. He was about to discover just how much was at stake, and how little his accumulated wisdom could do against forces that operated on scales beyond human ritual intervention.
To understand what Palenque III was fighting to preserve, you need to grasp the sheer scope of what was at risk.
This wasn't just one city-state facing hard times, this was the potential extinction of one of humanity's most sophisticated
civilizations, a culture that had achieved mathematical and astronomical breakthroughs that wouldn't be equaled elsewhere for centuries. The population under threat was staggering. At its peak in the 8th century, the Maya lowlands supported an estimated 8–10 million people of population density that wouldn't be seen again in that region until the 20th century. Palenque itself was home to perhaps 100,000 people when you included the urban core and all the surrounding settlements that formed its political territory. These weren't scattered villages, they were integrated communities connected by stone causeways, served by sophisticated water management systems, and organized around market centers that facilitated trade across hundreds of miles. The knowledge
at risk was even more valuable than the population.
The Maya had developed the most advanced writing system in the PI Columbian Americas, with over 800 hieroglyphic signs that could represent sounds, words, and concepts with remarkable precision.
Their books, written on bark paper and stored in temple libraries, contained astronomical tables, mathematical treatises, historical chronicles, and ritual instructions that represented the accumulated wisdom of over a millennium. Their mathematical achievements were extraordinary by any standard.
They had independently invented the concept of zero, a breakthrough that occurred in only a few places in human history.
Their number system, based on multiples of 20 rather than 10, allowed them to perform calculations involving millions and billions with ease.
They could predict eclipses centuries in advance, track the movements of Venus with precision that European astronomers wouldn't match until the telescope was invented. Their calendar system was perhaps the most sophisticated ever developed by any human society.
They maintained multiple interlocking cycles, a 260-day sacred calendar, a 365-day solar year, longer cycles based on Venus and Mars, and a long count system that could specify any date in a cycle lasting over 5,000 years.
They understood that the solar year was actually 365.24 days long, closer to the true value than the Julian calendar being used in Europe at the same time. The architectural and engineering knowledge embedded in their cities represented centuries of accumulated expertise. Palenque's builders had learned to construct multi-story buildings without metal tools, to create elaborate water management systems that controlled both flooding and drought, to carve stone with precision that modern sculptors struggle to match.
The palace complex alone contained over a dozen interconnected buildings, arranged around courtyards and connected by a maze of tunnels and stairways that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. But perhaps most importantly, the Maya had developed sustainable agricultural techniques that supported large populations without exhausting the environment.
Their forest gardens, raised fields, and terraced hillsides represented a form of ecological management that worked with natural systems rather than against them. They had learned to cultivate dozens of different crops in polyculture systems
that maintained soil fertility while providing diverse nutrition sources. All of this was at risk as the drought intensified, and the social system began to unravel. Kinich John Pakel III understood that he wasn't just responsible for maintaining religious ceremonies. He was the guardian of intellectual traditions that had taken millennia to develop and could be lost in a single generation if the chain of transmission was broken. The stakes extended beyond knowledge to identity itself. Mayan civilization was built around the concept of Kuhol Ajw divine rulership that connected earthly political authority to cosmic order.
Kings weren't just political leaders, they were living embodiments of supernatural power, responsible for maintaining the relationship between human society and the divine realm.
The high priest served as intermediaries in this relationship,
performing the rituals that kept the cosmic machinery functioning properly. If this system failed, if the rituals stopped working, if the rains didn't come, if the social order collapsed, it wouldn't just mean political change.
It would mean
the end of a worldview that had defined Mayan identity for over 1,000 years.
The very concepts that made someone Maya rather than something else were tied to participation in ritual cycles, acknowledgement of divine kingship, and integration into the complex calendar systems that regulated every aspect of life. Kinich John Pakel III was also acutely aware of what would be lost to future generations.
The Maya had a strong historical consciousness. Their inscriptions frequently referenced events that had occurred centuries earlier, and their rulers traced their genealogies back through dozens of generations. They understood themselves as participants in a continuous tradition that extended far into the past and was expected to continue far into the future. The long count calendar itself embodied this perspective, providing a framework for recording dates across cosmic time scales. The current world age had begun on a date that corresponds to August 11th, 3114 BCE in our calendar, and was expected to last until December 21st, 2012, see a span of over 5,000 years.
The Maya who lived during the classical period saw themselves as occupying a specific moment in this vast temporal framework, with responsibilities both to their ancestors and to descendants they would never meet. This long-term perspective made the current crisis even more devastating. Kinich John Pakel III wasn't just watching his own generation suffer, he was watching the potential termination of a historical tradition that was supposed to last for millennia. The burden of that responsibility, the weight of being potentially the last guardian of secrets that were meant to be eternal, must have been almost unbearable, and yet he couldn't simply abandon his post. The martyr believed that ritual failures could have cosmic consequences, that abandoning the ceremonies might not just doom their own civilization, but potentially damage the fundamental structure of reality itself. The high priest's role wasn't optional, it was a sacred duty that transcended personal survival or comfort. As the crisis deepened, Kinich John Pakel III found himself facing an impossible choice: continue performing rituals that seemed increasingly ineffective, or abandon traditions that defined the very essence of what it meant to be Maya. Either choice carried the risk of complete civilizational collapse,
but one also carried the burden of being the person who gave up on over 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the man responsible for navigating this crisis was about to discover just how many different
ways a civilization can fail, and how little individual knowledge and dedication can do against forces that operate on temporal and geographical scales far beyond human control. The drama unfolding across the Maya world in the late 8th century wasn't a simple story of environmental determinism. It was a complex human tragedy involving dozens of individual actors, each making rational decisions based on incomplete information.
each contributing to cascading failures that no one could fully predict or control. At the center of this unfolding catastrophe stood Kinich Charnopakul III, a man whose entire identity had been shaped by his role as guardian of cosmic order.
Born around 750 CE into the highest ranks of Palenque's priestly hierarchy, he had spent his childhood memorizing ritual procedures, astronomical calculations, and mythological narratives that connected every aspect of daily life to sacred meanings.
His education had been comprehensive and intensive, not just religious instruction, but training in mathematics, astronomy, history, medicine, and statecraft. At the time he assumed his full responsibilities as High Priest, Kinich Charnopakul III could perform bloodletting ceremonies that required precise timing based on Venus cycles, calculate the most auspicious dates for royal marriages decades in advance, and recite genealogies that traced Palenque's ruling dynasty back to mythological founders. He understood the relationship between agricultural cycles and ceremonial obligations, could interpret omens and dreams according to traditional protocols, and possessed detailed knowledge of the sacred geography that connected Palenque to other
important sites across the Maya world. But perhaps most importantly, he had been trained to think in terms of cosmic responsibility.
His personal fate was inseparable from his role as intermediary between human society and divine forces.
Success in maintaining ritual obligations wasn't just professional achievement, it was essential to the survival of everything he held sacred. Working alongside him was the king, Kinich Charnopakul II, who had assumed power around 760 for CE just as the environmental crisis was beginning to intensify.
Unlike his high priest, the king's responsibilities were primarily political and military, but in Maya society, these roles were inseparable from religious authority.
The king was expected to be a successful war leader, an effective administrator, and a divine intermediary capable of maintaining cosmic balance through personal charisma and ritual performance. Kinich Charnopakul II found himself caught between traditional expectations and unprecedented challenges.
His subjects expected him to ensure adequate rainfall, successful harvests, and protection from enemies, but the tools available to him were increasingly inadequate to address the scale of the problems he faced. Military campaigns that might have secured tribute from neighboring territories were becoming counterproductive as other city-states struggled with their own resource shortages.
Diplomatic initiatives that might have secured trade agreements were complicated by the fact that traditional trading partners were experiencing similar difficulties. The royal court that surrounded these two central figures was itself a complex ecosystem of competing interests and loyalties. High-ranking nobles who served as military commanders, tribute collectors, and regional administrators each brought their own perspectives on the developing crisis.
Some advocated for aggressive military campaigns to secure resources from weaker
neighbors.
Others argued for conservation measures and emergency rationing. Still others pushed for increased investment in ritual activities, believing that more elaborate ceremonies might succeed where traditional offerings had failed. Among the most influential court members was the royal scribe, whose responsibility for maintaining historical records gave him unique insight into how previous crises had been resolved. The Maya kept detailed chronicles of wars, droughts, floods, and political upheavals stretching back centuries, and the scribe spent long hours searching these records for precedents that might guide current decision-making. Unfortunately, the historical record contained no examples of environmental stress this severe or this widespread. Outside Palenque's immediate political circle, other actors were making decisions that would prove equally consequential.
In the tributary settlements that surrounded the capital, local leaders faced agonizing choices about resource allocation.
Should they continue sending tribute that might ensure continued protection from Palenque's military forces, or should
they conserve every available grain of maize for their own populations? The farmers whose agricultural labor supported the entire system were experiencing the crisis most directly. Years of unpredictable rainfall had taught them that traditional planting schedules were no longer reliable, but they had no alternative framework for making agricultural decisions. Some experimented with drought-resistant crops or new planting locations.
Others abandoned agriculture entirely, joining the growing population of refugees who wandered between settlements looking for opportunity or charity. Trade networks that
had connected the Maya world for centuries were breaking down as merchants found fewer customers and less surplus production to transport. The professional traders who had carried obsidian from Guatemala, jade from Belize, and cacao from the Pacific coast were being forced to find new occupations as demand for luxury goods collapsed and transportation routes became dangerous due to increased warfare and banditry. Regional rivals who had competed with Palenque for centuries saw opportunity in the city's distress.
The rulers of Tonaina, Palenque's traditional enemy to the south, launched increasingly aggressive raids designed to capture tribute, territory, and prestige. But they were also struggling with their own resource shortages, which made sustained military campaigns difficult to maintain. Even more distant powers were affected by the cascading crisis. Teotihuacan, the great city in central Mexico that had dominated Mesoamerican trade networks for centuries, was experiencing its own decline.
As Maya territories that had been important markets for its products became inaccessible, the connections that had integrated the Maya world into broader Mesoamerican civilization were being severed one by one. Perhaps the most tragic actors in this unfolding drama were the refugees people who had been forced to abandon their homes,
their fields, their local temples, and everything that had to find their identity in search of survival elsewhere. These weren't just statistics in some abstract demographic transition. They were individuals and families who had lost everything except their lives, carrying whatever portable possessions they could manage while looking for any community that
might accept them. Many of these refugees ended up in Palenque, creating additional strain on already stretched resources while bringing first-hand reports of conditions elsewhere in the Maya world.
Their stories of abandoned cities, failed harvests, warfare between former allies, and the breakdown of trade relationships provided Kinechchanapekal III with information about the broader scope of the crisis, but also with evidence that
the problems he was facing weren't unique to Palenque. Each of these actors was making rational decisions based on their understanding of the situation and their available options. The king was trying to maintain political authority in increasingly difficult circumstances.
The nobles were protecting their own interests while attempting to serve the broader community. The farmers were adapting their practices to changing
environmental conditions.
The merchants were seeking new opportunities as old ones disappeared.
The refugees were simply trying to survive. But the sum total of all these rational individual decisions was a system-wide failure that none of them had intended and few of them fully understood. Kinechchanapekal III found himself at the center
of this vortex of human agency and environmental constraint, trying to maintain spiritual practices that had been designed for a stable world in circumstances that were anything but stable. The weight of all these individual tragedies, all these separate streams of human suffering converging on his ritual responsibilities, was about to test every aspect of his training and faith in ways that no previous generation of Maya priests had ever experienced. By 805 CE, what had begun as localized agricultural difficulties had metastasized into a full-scale civilizational crisis that no amount of ritual intervention seemed capable of addressing.
Kinechchanapekal II's detailed records carved into stone monuments and written on bark paper scrolls document a progression of failures that reads like a clinical study in how complex societies disintegrate. The agricultural crisis had moved beyond simple drought into something approaching ecological collapse. The forest gardens that had sustained Palenque for centuries were dying not just from lack of water, but from cascading environmental changes that drought had triggered. Soil erosion from failed terraced fields was silting up the canal systems that regulated water flow during the rainy season. The careful balance between cultivated areas and forest reserves that had maintained biodiversity while supporting human populations was breaking down as desperate farmers cleared marginal lands that should have been left alone. Even more ominously,
the complex polyculture systems that had provided nutritional security were failing in sequence.
Maize yields were down by more than half in most areas.
The beans and squash that traditionally accompanied maize in Maya agricultural plots were
also struggling with the changed rainfall patterns. Tree crops like cacao, avocado, and bread nut that had provided supplementary nutrition and trade goods were producing irregular harvests that made long-term planning impossible. Kinechchanapekal III found himself performing increasingly desperate. Rituals as traditional ceremonies failed to produce their expected results. The bloodletting offerings that had once been sufficient to petition the rain god Chark were escalated to include human sacrifice first of captured enemies, then of volunteers from within Palenque's own population who believed their deaths might purchase divine intervention. The astronomical calculations that had once provided precise guidance for ritual timing were becoming counterproductive, as environmental conditions no longer followed predictable patterns.
Ceremonies scheduled according to Venus cycles or eclipse predictions continued to be performed on their traditional dates, but their failure to produce expected results was undermining faith in the entire system of cosmic correspondence that
formed the foundation of Maya religious practice. Political relationships that had maintained stability for generations were collapsing under resource stress. Tributary settlements that had sent regular payments of maize, textiles, and labor to Palenque were defaulting on their obligations, not out of rebellion, but out of inability to produce the required goods. Some sent delegations explaining their difficulties and requesting temporary relief. Others simply stopped communicating, leaving Palenque's administrators uncertain whether tribute territories had been lost to enemy conquest, demographic collapse, or simple abandonment. The tribute collectors who had once traveled established routes on predictable schedules were reporting increasingly dangerous conditions in the countryside. What had once been prosperous agricultural settlements were becoming refugee camps where displaced populations competed for dwindling resources.
local leaders who had once welcomed tribute collectors as representatives of legitimate authority were treating them as unwelcome additional mouths to feed. Military campaigns that might have restored tributary relationships through force were becoming impossible to sustain. Palenque's army depended on the same agricultural surplus that was disappearing throughout the region.
Soldiers couldn't be fed, equipped, or paid if the economic foundation of military service was collapsing. Even successful raids against weaker neighbors were producing diminishing returns as there was less wealth available to capture. The breakdown of long-distance trade was eliminating access to resources that had become essential to Palenque's economy.
Over centuries of regional integration, obsidian tools and weapons were becoming scarce as trade routes from the volcanic highlands were disrupted. Salt, essential for food preservation and ceramic production, was in short supply as coastal trading relationships broke down.
Even basic materials like limestone for construction and flint for tools were becoming difficult to obtain as the regional networks that had supplied them disappeared. Cultural institutions that had maintained social cohesion were also failing. The elaborate festivals that had once brought together populations from across Palenque's territory were being cancelled due to inability to provide the food, drink, and entertainment that made such gatherings possible.
The ball courts where ritual games had reinforced social hierarchies and religious beliefs were empty, because the rubber balls required for play could no longer be obtained from distant suppliers. The educational system that had maintained and
transmitted specialized knowledge was breaking down as families focused on immediate survival rather than long-term learning.
Young people who should have been apprenticed to master craftsmen, scribes, or priests were instead working in the fields or joining the growing population of refugees. The chain of knowledge transmission that linked each generation to accumulated wisdom was being severed at multiple points simultaneously. Palenque III was particularly concerned about the loss of scribal knowledge.
The complex writing system that recorded everything from astronomical observations to historical chronicles required years of intensive study to master.
As economic conditions deteriorated, fewer families could afford to support children through the lengthy education required to become literate. The number of people capable of reading and writing Maya hieroglyphs was declining precipitously, threatening the preservation of the very records that might guide recovery efforts. The psychological impact of these cascading failures was perhaps
even more devastating than their material consequences.
The Maya had built their entire worldview around the assumption that proper ritual performance could maintain cosmic order and ensure human welfare. The obvious failure of traditional ceremonies to address the current crisis was undermining not just religious authority, but the fundamental beliefs that gave meaning to Maya identity. Reports from refugees and traders indicated that the crisis
was not limited to Palenque but was affecting the entire Maya world.
Copan had been abandoned by its ruling dynasty.
Tikal was experiencing civil war between competing noble factions. Cities in the northern Yucatan were being abandoned entirely
as their populations migrated to areas where water was still available.
The integrated civilization that had flourished for over 6 centuries was fragmenting into isolated communities struggling for individual survival. Palenque III realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in Maya experience, not just political upheaval or temporary environmental stress, but the potential end of classical Maya civilization itself. The knowledge he had spent his lifetime acquiring might become irrelevant if there was no longer a functioning society capable of supporting the specialized roles that made such knowledge valuable. But even as evidence mounted that traditional approaches were failing, he couldn't simply abandon his responsibilities. The martyr believed that neglecting ritual obligations could have cosmic consequences far beyond the immediate crisis.
If the ceremonies that maintained universal order were discontinued, the current world age itself might come to an end, bringing
even greater catastrophe than what was already occurring. The escalation was approaching a point where individual decisions, no matter how wise or well-intentioned, would be overwhelmed by forces operating on scales beyond human control. Kinich Jarnapakel III was about to discover that sometimes the most dedicated guardian of traditional wisdom must choose between preserving ancient knowledge and acknowledging that the world has changed in ways that make that knowledge obsolete.
The moment that changed everything came not with dramatic revelation, but with quiet recognition of an impossible arithmetic.
It was the dry season of 809 CE, and Kinich Jarnapakel III was conducting his annual inventory of Palenque stored
resources, a ritual responsibility that had become increasingly grim with each passing year. The numbers were undeniable. The royal granaries that had once held enough maize to feed Palenque's population through 2 years of crop failure now contained barely 6 months' supply for the reduced population that still remained.
The tributary territories that had once
provided reliable food supplies had sent less than 30% of their traditional obligations over the past 3 years.
Many had sent nothing at all. More critically, the seed reserves that would be needed for the upcoming planting season
had been consumed during the previous year's emergency rationing.
Even if the rains returned to normal patterns, which seemed increasingly unlikely, Palenque lacked the agricultural foundation needed to restart production at subsistence levels, much less at the surplus levels required to support urban civilization. Kinich Jarnapakel III understood that he was looking at numbers that described the end of everything he had spent his life trying to preserve. The realization didn't come all at once.
Like most catastrophic recognitions, it built gradually as he cross-referenced
different categories of information that had previously seemed unrelated. The population estimates provided by district administrators showed that Palenque had lost nearly 40% of its residents over the past decade, mostly throughout migration rather than mortality. The tribute records showed that agricultural production in surrounding territories had declined even more dramatically. The trade inventories documented the near-complete breakdown of the commercial relationships that had once brought essential goods from hundreds of miles away, but it was the astronomical calculations that provided the final, brutal clarity. The Venus tables that guided agricultural timing suggested that the next major planting season would occur during a period of maximum drought probability according to the long-term weather patterns he had been tracking.
The eclipse cycle indicated that the most important ceremonies of the following year would coincide with the period when food shortages would be most severe.
The calendar correlations that had once provided reassurance about cosmic order now painted a picture of converging disasters that no amount of ritual intervention could prevent. For the first time in his life, Kinich Jarnapakel III found himself questioning not just the effectiveness of specific ceremonies, but the fundamental
assumptions that made his role meaningful. If the gods were not responding to traditional offerings, if the cosmic forces that governed weather and agricultural fertility were no longer following predictable patterns, if the accumulated wisdom of over a millennium was proving inadequate to address current challenges, what did that say about the entire worldview that had defined Maya's civilization?
The king, Kinich Kakbalam II, had been conducting his own calculations, and his conclusions were equally devastating.
The military forces that had once protected Palenque's territorial integrity could no longer be maintained at effective
strength. The administrative apparatus that had governed tributary territories was collapsing as local officials abandoned their posts or declared independence. The royal court that had once attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across Mesoamerica was reduced to a handful of essential personnel struggling to maintain basic governmental functions. During a private meeting in the palace's innermost chamber, a room decorated with murals depicting the cosmic tree that connected the underworld, earth, and sky, the king and high priest acknowledged what neither had been willing to say aloud. Palenque, as a functioning city-state, was finished. The question was no longer how to restore previous prosperity, but how to manage an orderly transition to whatever would come next. The conversation was conducted in the formal language reserved for the most serious state occasions. but its content was revolutionary.
For the first time in recorded Maya history, a legitimate ruler and high priest were discussing the voluntary abandonment of a major city.
Not abandonment due to military conquest or natural disaster, but strategic withdrawal in recognition that the economic and environmental foundations of urban civilization had been permanently altered. Kinich Jarnapakel III proposed a radical solution, a planned dispersal of Palenque's remaining population to smaller, more sustainable communities scattered throughout the region. The specialized knowledge that had been concentrated in the capital, astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, historical records, ritual procedures, would be distributed among multiple centers to increase the chances that some of
it would survive even if individual communities failed. The king initially resisted this proposal,
not because he disagreed with the analysis, but because it meant abandoning the concept of divine kingship that had legitimized Maya political authority for over 1,000 years.
How could he maintain his role as sacred ruler if there was no kingdom left to rule? How could the elaborate ceremonies that connected earthly political power to cosmic order be performed without the temples, pyramids, and ritual spaces that had been specifically constructed for such purposes? But Kinich Jarnapakel III had an answer that demonstrated both his deep understanding of Maya religious philosophy and his pragmatic recognition of changed circumstances.
The sacred wasn't tied to specific locations, it was embedded in knowledge,
relationships, and practices that could be maintained even under radically different social conditions. The cosmic responsibilities that defined kingship and priesthood could be fulfilled through modified ceremonies adapted to new environmental and social realities. The decision to begin planning for Palenque's abandonment represented a fundamental
shift in Maya thinking about the relationship between human society and divine will.
Rather than interpreting the current crisis as punishment for ritual failures that required more intensive ceremonial response, they were choosing to understand it as evidence that the gods themselves had decided to transform the conditions under which human civilization operated. This theological innovation allowed them to abandon traditional approaches without abandoning religious faith itself. They weren't giving up on their relationship with divine forces. They were adapting that relationship to new circumstances that required different forms of expression. The practical planning for this transition occupied the next 2 years and demonstrated both the organizational sophistication that had built Maya's civilization and the flexibility needed to dismantle it responsibly.
Kinich Jarnapakel III worked with the royal scribes to identify which knowledge was most essential to preserve and how it could be distributed among multiple repositories to ensure survival. The most critical astronomical observations were carved into stone monuments that could survive centuries of abandonment.
The mathematical techniques needed for calendar calculations were condensed into portable codices that could be carried by traveling priests.
The historical records that legitimized royal genealogies were copied multiple times and distributed to allied communities that might maintain Maya political traditions. Even if Palenque itself was abandoned, medical knowledge accumulated over
centuries was organized into practical manuals that local healers could use without requiring extensive formal education.
Agricultural techniques adapted to changing environmental conditions were documented in forms that could guide farming communities, even if the complex administrative systems that had coordinated regional food production were no longer functioning. The ritual procedures that maintained cosmic order were modified to be performable by smaller groups with fewer resources while retaining their essential spiritual functions. The elaborate bloodletting ceremonies that had required royal participation
were simplified into forms that local priests could conduct.
The ball game rituals that had required specially constructed courts were adapted to use natural landscape features. Perhaps most importantly, they developed strategies for maintaining cultural continuity even under conditions of demographic dispersal.
Marriage networks that would preserve genetic diversity while maintaining social connections.
Trade relationships that would allow scattered communities to share resources and information.
Festival cycles that would bring dispersed populations together periodically to renew cultural bonds and exchange knowledge. The king established protocols for transferring political authority to regional leaders who would maintain Maya governmental traditions in smaller territories.
The high priest trained subordinates who could perform essential ceremonies in multiple locations, ensuring that ritual obligations would continue to be met even if the centralized priesthood was dissolved. By 811 CE, these preparations were complete. The decision had been made, the resources allocated. the knowledge preserved and distributed.
All that remained was the execution of a plan that would end over 7 centuries of continuous occupation at one of the Maya world's most important centers.
Kinich Jana Paikul III spent his final months in Palenque conducting ceremonies that had never been performed before, rituals of closure, thanksgiving, and transition that acknowledged the end of one phase of Maya history while preparing for whatever would come next.
These weren't ceremonies of defeat or despair, but a conscious choice to adapt rather than perish on the autumn equinox of 811 CE. Kinich Jana Paikul III climbed the steps of Temple 14 for the final time as Palenque's resident high priest. The ceremony he performed that evening was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, the last official ritual in Palenque's long history as a functioning city, and the first ceremony of a new phase of Maya civilization that would be defined by adaptation, dispersal, and survival rather than monumental architecture and centralized authority. As he descended those steps in the Pioi dawn darkness, Kinich Jana Paikul III was no longer the high priest of a great city-state. He was something entirely new in Maya history, a keeper of ancient wisdom, preparing to guide his people through a transformation that no previous generation had ever imagined necessary. The turning point was complete.
What came next would determine whether Maya civilization could reinvent itself or would join the list of complex societies that had failed to adapt to changing environmental conditions.
The evacuation of Palenque began with the sunrise ceremonies of 812 CE and continued for nearly 3 months, proceeding according to carefully planned stages that reflected both practical necessity and ritual significance.
Kinich Jana Paikul III had insisted that the abandonment follow ceremonial protocols that would maintain spiritual continuity even as the physical center of Maya civilization was being dissolved. The first to leave were the specialized craftsmen, whose skills required the least territorial attachment: scribes, astronomers, physicians, and artists who could practice their professions in any community with sufficient resources to support them. They carried with them the most portable forms of accumulated knowledge: codices containing mathematical tables, astronomical observations, medical treatises, and historical records that represented the intellectual achievement of centuries. Kinich Jana Paikul III personally supervised the distribution of these materials, ensuring that no single destination received a complete collection that might be lost to accident or attack, but that every major repository contained enough information to maintain basic functionality. The Venus tables went to 3 different communities. The eclipse calculations were divided among 5 locations. The historical chronicles were copied and dispersed so widely that even the complete loss of several communities wouldn't eliminate the record entirely. The royal family departed next, traveling to allied territories where their genealogical legitimacy might provide political stability for communities struggling with their own challenges.
Kinich Kakbalam too established a smaller court in a hill town 50 miles southeast of Palenque, where he continued to perform the essential ceremonies of kingship while governing a territory that could actually be sustained by available
resources. The administrative personnel who had managed tribute collection, trade relationships, and territorial governance scattered to regional centers where their expertise might help smaller communities develop more effective organizational structures.
Many carried with them detailed knowledge of agricultural techniques, water management systems, and craft production that had been developed specifically for the environmental conditions of the Maya lowlands. The general population dispersed according to kinship networks and economic relationships that had been maintained alongside the formal political structure. Extended families moved together to areas where they had relatives or trading partners.
Craft specialists joined communities that needed their particular skills.
Farmers relocated to regions where agricultural conditions seemed more promising. Kinich
Jana Paikul III himself remained in Palenque until the very end, conducting final ceremonies in each of the major temples before they were formally closed and their sacred objects removed or hidden. The rituals of closure were as elaborate as those that had once dedicated the buildings, recognizing that proper spiritual procedures were necessary even for endings. The Temple of Inscriptions, built to house the tomb of the great Kinich Jana
Paikul I, received special attention. The hieroglyphic texts that recorded the achievements of Palenque's greatest ruler were carefully documented and copied before the temple was sealed with offerings that would maintain its sacred status, even
during abandonment. Kinich Jana Paikul III understood that future generations might return to this site, and he wanted to ensure they would find evidence of Maya achievement rather than simple ruins. The palace complex, which had served as both royal residence and administrative centre, was systematically emptied of its portable treasures but left structurally intact. The elaborate murals that decorated its chambers were covered with protective lime plaster. The throne room was sealed with offerings that acknowledged the end of Palenque's political independence while maintaining the possibility that legitimate Maya rulership might someday return. The ball courts where cosmic dramas had been enacted through ritual sport were cleaned and prepared for indefinite closure.
The rubber balls that had been essential equipment were buried with ceremonies that transferred their spiritual power to other locations where the games might continue.
The stone rings through which players had once tried to pass the ball were
covered but not removed, preserving the possibility that future occupants might restore the courts to active use. By the end of 812 CE, Palenque's urban core was essentially empty.
The terraced fields that had surrounded the city were already being reclaimed by secondary forest growth. The canal systems that had managed water flow during rainy seasons were slowly silting up. The causeways that had connected different sections of the city were disappearing under vegetation that no one was maintaining. But the abandonment wasn't complete abandonment. Kinich Palenque III had established a rotation system whereby small groups of caretakers would return periodically
to perform essential maintenance ceremonies, check on cash supplies, and monitor the condition of important buildings.
These caretaker visits continued for several decades, maintaining some human presence even as the city ceased to function as a living community. The broader Maya world was experiencing similar transitions throughout the early 9th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that most of the great classical Maya cities were abandoned or drastically reduced in population during this period. But unlike the sudden collapses that had destroyed other civilizations, the Maya transformation appears to have been largely managed rather than chaotic. Communities that had once sent tribute to major centers began developing more local self-sufficiency.
Regional trade networks were reorganized around shorter distances and more specialized products.
Agricultural techniques were adapted to support smaller populations with greater environmental resilience. Political authority was redistributed among local leaders who maintained Maya governmental traditions without the elaborate court culture that had characterized the classical period. Kinich Palenque III spent his final years traveling among these dispersed communities, serving as a living link to the traditions they were working to preserve under changed circumstances. His astronomical knowledge remained valuable for timing agricultural activities and religious ceremonies. His understanding of ritual procedures helped local priests adapt traditional practices to new conditions.
His memory of historical precedents provided guidance for communities facing unprecedented challenges, but perhaps most importantly, his personal authority as the last high priest of Palenque provided legitimacy for the innovations that were necessary for survival. When he endorsed modifications to traditional ceremonies or approved new approaches to old problems, his approval carried the weight of authentic connection to the classical tradition that these communities were working to continue. The knowledge
Preservation efforts were remarkably successful. Much of what we know today about classical Maya civilization comes from records that were created or preserved during this period of transition.
The mathematical techniques, astronomical observations,
and historical chronicles that had been concentrated in major centers were successfully distributed among enough smaller repositories that the
intellectual achievements of Maya civilization survived even when the cities themselves were abandoned. The long count calendar continued to be maintained by scattered communities of specialists who coordinated their observations through networks
that replaced the centralized authority of the classical period. Religious ceremonies adapted to local conditions while preserving their essential spiritual functions. Craft traditions were maintained by guilds that traveled between communities rather than being concentrated in urban centers. The agricultural innovations developed during the crisis period proved remarkably durable.
Drought-resistant crops that
had been experimental during the worst years of the collapse became standard elements of Maya farming.
Water management techniques that had been developed for emergency conditions were refined into sustainable practices.
Forest garden methods that could support smaller populations while maintaining ecological diversity became the foundation for a more environmentally sustainable form of Maya civilization. But there were also profound losses that couldn't be recovered. The monumental architecture that had expressed Maya achievement in stone was never again built on the scale of the classical period. The elaborate court culture that had supported full-time specialists in dozens of fields was replaced by more generalized knowledge systems that could be maintained by smaller communities.
The regional integration that had connected the Maya world through trade, political alliance, and shared culture was replaced by more localized networks with less capacity for long-distance coordination. Kinaj III died around 835.
See, in a small highland community where he had established one of his traveling schools for ritual specialists.
His funeral was attended by representatives from dozens of communities across the former Maya territories, acknowledging his role in
preserving cultural continuity through the greatest transformation in Maya history.
His death marked the end of direct personal connection to the classical period, but the institutional structures he had helped create continued to function for centuries. The distributed knowledge preservation system maintained Maya intellectual traditions through the post-classical period and into the time of European contact.
The modified political structures provided governance for Maya communities that survived colonial conquest and continue to maintain cultural identity today. The fallout from classical Maya collapse was thus both devastating and creative devastating. In its destruction of urban civilization that had flourished for over 6 centuries, but creative in its development of alternative forms of social organization that proved more sustainable under changed environmental conditions. Kinaj III had helped guide his civilization through a transformation that few complex societies have successfully managed, conscious adaptation to environmental change rather than simple collapse and extinction. The story of Kinaj III and the abandonment of Palenque operates on multiple symbolic levels that extend far beyond its immediate historical significance. At its deepest level, it represents the eternal human struggle between continuity and change, between the desire to preserve accumulated wisdom and the necessity of adapting to transformed circumstances. The figure of the high priest himself embodies this tension in particularly poignant ways. Trained from childhood to be the guardian of eternal truths, he found himself forced to become an agent of unprecedented change. His entire identity had been constructed around the assumption that proper ritual performance could maintain cosmic order indefinitely.
Yet, he ultimately had to acknowledge that the cosmos itself had changed in ways that made traditional approaches obsolete. This transformation from conservative guardian to innovative adapter reflects a deeper symbolic pattern that appears throughout human history.
The most effective responses to civilizational crises often come not from revolutionary outsiders, but from traditional insiders who possess both the authority to legitimate change and the knowledge to guide it effectively. Kinaj III could successfully lead the abandonment of Palenque precisely because his credentials as defender of Maya tradition were unquestionable. The physical abandonment of the city represents another layer of symbolic meaning about the relationship between place and identity. For over 7 centuries, Palenque had been more than just a location. It had been the embodiment of Maya achievement, the physical manifestation of cosmic order, the tangible proof that human civilization could create permanent beauty in harmony
with natural forces. The decision to voluntarily abandon this monument to Maya accomplishment required a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to be Maya.
Identity had to be disconnected from specific places and reconnected to portable practices, knowledge systems, and social relationships that could survive demographic dispersal and environmental change. This shift from place-based to practice-based identity has profound implications for how we understand cultural continuity. The Maya who dispersed from Palenque didn't cease to be Maya, they became Maya in a different way, one that proved more resilient to environmental stress, but perhaps less capable of the monumental achievements that had characterized their classical period. The preservation and distribution of knowledge represents yet another symbolic dimension of this story. Kinaj systematic effort to ensure that Maya intellectual achievements would survive in multiple locations reflects a sophisticated understanding of institutional vulnerability.
Centralized knowledge systems are efficient but fragile. They can achieve remarkable heights, but can also be completely destroyed by single catastrophic events. The distributed knowledge preservation system that emerged from the classical Maya collapse has symbolic relevance for contemporary concerns about information security, cultural preservation, and institutional resilience.
In an age when digital technologies have made both global knowledge sharing and catastrophic information loss more possible than ever before, the Maya example provides insights into how essential knowledge can be maintained across generations, even under conditions of social transformation. The relationship between environmental change and civilizational adaptation that drives this narrative has perhaps the most urgent symbolic significance for contemporary audiences. The Maya faced a crisis where their traditional approaches to environmental management became inadequate, not because they were poorly designed, but because the environmental conditions for which they had been designed no longer existed. This situation
parallels contemporary concerns about climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation that may require fundamental transformations in how human societies organize themselves.
The Maya example demonstrates both the possibility and the cost of successful adaptation. They survived as a people and a culture, but they had to abandon much of what had previously defined their civilization. The role of leadership during civilizational crisis is another symbolic theme that resonates across historical periods. John Palenque III faced the terrible burden of making decisions that would affect not just his own generation, but centuries of future generations. His choices about what knowledge to preserve, which traditions to maintain, and how to organize the transition from one form of civilization to another had consequences that extended far beyond his lifetime. This burden of transgenerational responsibility reflects the weight that falls on leaders during periods of fundamental change. They must make decisions based on incomplete information about future conditions while bearing responsibility for outcomes they will never live to see. The Maya example suggests that effective crisis leadership requires both deep knowledge of traditional approaches and creative flexibility about how those approaches might need to be modified. The spiritual dimension of this story provides symbolic insights into how religious and philosophical systems can both constrain and enable social adaptation. Maya religious beliefs could have prevented effective response to the crisis if they had been interpreted rigidly, if abandoning the temples had been seen as unthinkable apostasy rather than necessary adaptation. John Palenque's theological innovation, his reinterpretation of divine will as requiring transformation rather than resistance to change, allowed Maya civilization to maintain spiritual continuity while accepting social discontinuity. This suggests that the most resilient belief systems are those that can provide meaning and guidance for adaptation rather than only for preservation. The story also symbolizes the complex relationship between individual agency and historical forces. John Palenque III was clearly a person of exceptional ability and dedication who made crucial decisions that influenced the outcome of the crisis, but he was also operating within constraints imposed by environmental conditions, demographic pressures, and cultural expectations that limited his range of possible choices. This tension between individual influence and structural determination reflects broader philosophical questions about historical causation and human responsibility that extend far beyond Maya civilization. How much can individual leaders actually accomplish when operating within systems that are experiencing fundamental stress? What kinds of leadership are most effective during periods of rapid change? The ultimate symbolism of this story may lie in its demonstration that civilizational collapse and civilizational transformation are not necessarily the same thing. The classical Maya civilization that had built Palenque certainly ended, but Maya civilization itself continued in modified forms that proved more sustainable under changed conditions. This distinction between institutional collapse and cultural extinction has profound implications for how we understand social resilience and historical continuity. Societies that appear to collapse from external perspectives may actually be adapting in ways that preserve their essential characteristics while abandoning features that have become counterproductive. The story of John Palenque III thus becomes a parable about the possibility of conscious adaptation to change circumstances, about the potential for traditional wisdom and innovative flexibility to work together in creating sustainable responses to unprecedented challenges. It suggests that the most profound changes may sometimes require not the abandonment of accumulated knowledge, but its creative reapplication to transformed conditions. In an era when human civilization faces environmental and social challenges that may require fundamental transformations in how we organize ourselves, the symbolic lessons embedded in this Maya story offer both warning and hope. Warning about the fragility of even the most sophisticated social systems, but hope about
the possibility of conscious adaptation that preserves essential values while abandoning practices that have become obsolete.
the parallels between the crisis that confronted Kinich III in the 9th century and the challenges facing human civilization in the 21st century are both striking and instructive. While the specific details differ dramatically, the underlying patterns of environmental stress, social complexity, and adaptive challenge show remarkable similarities across the span of more than a millennium. Climate change represents the most obvious parallel. Like the Maya, contemporary civilization has developed complex social, economic, and technological systems that depend on relatively stable environmental conditions.
Our agricultural systems are optimized for historical weather patterns.
Our urban infrastructure assumes predictable seasonal cycles. Our economic models are based on resource availability that may not persist under changed climatic conditions. The terminal classic drought that devastated Maya civilization was a regional
phenomenon lasting several decades. Contemporary climate change is a global phenomenon that may persist for centuries.
The scale is different, but the basic challenge is the same. How do complex societies adapt to environmental conditions that no longer match the assumptions on which their institutions were built?
Modern agricultural systems show particular vulnerabilities
that echo Maya experience. Industrial agriculture has achieved remarkable productivity through specialization and optimization, but these same characteristics make it fragile when confronted with unprecedented conditions.
Monoculture crops that are highly productive under ideal conditions can fail catastrophically when those conditions change. Intensive farming techniques that maximize short-term yields can degrade soil fertility and reduce long-term sustainability. The Maya had developed polyculture systems that provided greater resilience to environmental stress, but at the cost of lower peak productivity. Contemporary discussions about sustainable agriculture often focus on similar trade-offs between efficiency and resilience, between maximizing current output and maintaining long-term productive capacity. Urban systems provide another area of parallel concern. Maya cities like Palenque were marvels of engineering that supported large populations through sophisticated water management, waste disposal, and food distribution systems. But these systems required constant maintenance and coordination that became impossible to sustain when the economic surplus that funded them disappeared. Contemporary urban areas face similar vulnerabilities.
Cities concentrate populations at densities that require complex technological systems for basic survival.
Electrical grids, water treatment facilities, transportation networks, and food distribution systems must all function continuously to prevent humanitarian disasters. Like Maya cities, modern urban areas are efficient but fragile, capable of supporting large populations under normal conditions but vulnerable to cascading failures when stressed beyond their design parameters. The breakdown of long-distance
trade networks that contributed to Maya decline has contemporary echoes in concerns about supply chain resilience and economic globalization.
The efficiency gains from specialized production and global trade come with increased vulnerability to disruptions that can propagate across continents within days or weeks. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a preview of how quickly interconnected
systems can fail when confronted with unexpected stresses.
Supply chains that had been optimized for cost efficiency proved inadequate for maintaining essential services during crisis conditions. Just-in-time inventory systems that minimized storage costs became liabilities when transportation networks were disrupted. Political fragmentation represents another parallel between Maya and contemporary experience. The breakdown of intercity cooperation that characterized the terminal classic period reflected the difficulty of maintaining collaborative relationships when resources become scarce and communities must choose between local survival and broader solidarity. Contemporary international relations show similar strains as environmental pressures, resource competition, and demographic changes create conflicts that transcend traditional diplomatic frameworks. Climate change impacts that cross national boundaries, refugee flows that overwhelm existing immigration systems, and resource scarcities that pit trading partners against each other all echo the political fragmentation that accompanied Maya decline. The role of expertise and institutional knowledge provides perhaps the most direct parallel to Kinich situation. Contemporary societies depend on specialized knowledge systems that require continuous institutional support to maintain
scientific research, technological innovation, educational systems, and cultural preservation, or require stable funding, and social commitment that could be threatened by severe economic or political disruption, like Maya scribes and astronomers. Contemporary specialists are custodians of accumulated knowledge that has taken generations to develop but could be lost
within a single generation if the institutions that support them collapse.
The question of how to preserve essential knowledge through periods of social transformation is as relevant today as it was for Maya high priests planning the abandonment of their cities. However, there are also crucial differences that suggest
contemporary civilization might have advantages that the Maya lack. Global communication systems provide mechanisms for coordinating responses to shared challenges that were unavailable to geographically isolated Maya cities.
Scientific understanding
of environmental systems provides predictive capabilities that Maya astronomers, despite their sophistication, could not achieve.
International institutions, however imperfect, provide frameworks for cooperation that transcend the city-state rivalries that prevented effective Maya coordination. Perhaps most importantly, contemporary societies have historical precedents like the Maya example to learn from. We can study how previous civilizations have responded to environmental stress, which approaches have been successful, and which have led to collapse. This historical knowledge doesn't guarantee successful adaptation, but it provides insights that weren't available to the Maya during their crisis. The distributed knowledge preservation strategies that Kinich Palenque III developed have
contemporary applications in digital information systems, cultural preservation efforts, and educational policies designed to maintain essential capabilities even under stress conditions.
The principle of avoiding single points of failure applies as much to information systems as it did to Maya codex preservation. The theological innovation that allowed Maya civilization to reinterpret change as divinely mandated rather than spiritually forbidden has parallels in contemporary efforts to reconcile traditional values with adaptive necessity. Religious and philosophical systems that can provide meaning and guidance for transformation rather than only for preservation may be essential for successful navigation of unprecedented challenges. The Maya example also demonstrates that successful adaptation may require abandoning some achievements in order to preserve others. Classical Maya civilization produced remarkable art, architecture, and intellectual accomplishments, but maintaining these achievements became impossible under changed environmental conditions. Contemporary societies may face similar choices about which aspects of current civilization can be sustained and which may need to be modified or abandoned. The story of Kinich Palenque III suggests that the most effective leadership during civilizational transitions may come from individuals who combine deep knowledge of traditional approaches with creative flexibility about how those approaches might need to be modified. This has implications for educational systems, leadership development, and institutional design in societies that may need to navigate fundamental transformations. Ultimately, the modern echo of the Maya experience is both warning and opportunity. Warning that even sophisticated civilizations can face environmental challenges that require fundamental social transformation, but also opportunity to learn from historical precedents, to develop adaptive strategies before they become desperately necessary, and to guide transformation rather than simply react to crises. The question facing contemporary civilization is whether we can achieve the kind of conscious adaptation that Kinich Palenque III managed for his people, preserving essential values and knowledge while abandoning practices that have become counterproductive, or whether we will repeat the pattern of societies that failed to adapt successfully to changed conditions. The Maya survived their civilizational transformation and continue to maintain cultural identity today, over 1,000 years after the abandonment of their classical cities. Their example suggests that conscious adaptation is possible, but it requires leadership, planning, and the wisdom to distinguish between what must be preserved and what can be changed. In our own time of unprecedented global challenges, the story of the last high priest of Palenque offers both a cautionary tale about the fragility of complex societies and an inspiring example of how traditional wisdom and innovative adaptation can work together to navigate fundamental change. The choice, as it was for Kinich Palenque III, is ours to make. As dawn broke over the empty plazas of Palenque on that morning in 812 CE, Kinich Palenque III completed the final ritual of his tenure as high priest. The ceremony he had just performed, unprecedented in Maya tradition, was simultaneously
an ending and a beginning, an acknowledgement of loss and a commitment to continuity behind him. The temples that had defined Maya achievement for centuries stood silent but intact, waiting for whatever future might bring.
Ahead of him lay uncertainty, but also the possibility that Maya civilization might find new forms of expression adapted to changed conditions. He carried with him not just the portable treasures of accumulated knowledge, but the heavier burden
of having successfully guided his people through a transformation that preserved their essential identity, while abandoning much of what had previously defined their world. The last high priest of Palenque had become something entirely new. The
first guardian of Maya tradition, flexible enough to recognize that true preservation sometimes requires profound change.
His story reminds us that the deepest wisdom may lie not in maintaining the past unchanged, but in understanding how timeless values can find expression through transformed practices. In our own time of rapid change and unprecedented challenges,
we would do well to remember both the burden and the possibility that Kinich Chana Palenque III carried down those temple steps into an uncertain dawn.
The weight of time presses on every generation, but so does the opportunity to shape what time
will bring. The choice, as always, is ours to make.